The scent of lemon verbena and bleached linen was the first thing Elena Vargas noticed, a sterile perfume that clung to the air in the penthouse corridors of the Obsidian Hotel. At 22, she moved with an economy of motion that belied her age, her hands, raw and chapped, expertly smoothing a crease from a silk duvet. She was a ghost in this world of polished marble and hushed opulence, her presence marked only by the absence of disorder she left in her wake. Her reflection, caught for a fleeting second in the gleaming surface of a black lacquer wardrobe, showed a stranger with tired eyes and a face that had forgotten how to hold a genuine smile. This was her life, a collection of silent, gilded rooms, each one a testament to a world she could only ever observe through a pane of unbreakable glass. If you want to discover what pushes this quiet girl to the edge of a decision that will shatter her world, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. We continue. Her movements were a practiced, silent ballet of efficiency. She replenished miniature bottles of imported toiletries, folded towels into crisp, perfect squares, and erased the fingerprints of the wealthy from every surface, all while her mind drifted far from the task at hand. Elena had mastered the art of being invisible, a skill learned not by choice but by necessity. She saw the remnants of lives lived in loud, vibrant color, a discarded champagne cork, a single earring lost beneath a bed, a scribbled note of passion left on a nightstand. She would meticulously clean it all away, restoring the room to a state of impersonal perfection, a blank canvas for the next guest, feeling like she was erasing parts of herself in the process, leaving her own canvas perpetually, achingly blank. There was a stillness in her, a part of her soul that remained untouched, not by religious conviction or romantic idealism, but by the simple, crushing lack of opportunity. Her virginity was not a treasure she guarded, but a room in her house she had never had the time or permission to enter. It was a consequence of a life lived in service, a youth sacrificed at the altar of responsibility. While other girls her age were discovering the clumsy, thrilling language of touch and affection, Elena was learning the sterile vocabulary of medical charts and the cold calculus of hospital bills. Her body was a vessel for carrying the weight of her family's hope, leaving no room for her own desires, her own story, or the simple human need to be held for no reason at all. Every day was a study in contrasts that carved a hollow space within her chest. She would scrub the sprawling marble bathtub in a suite overlooking Central Park, her mind picturing the cramped, perpetually damp bathroom in her queen's apartment. She would handle discarded designer clothes, the fabric a whisper of impossible luxury against her fingertips, while acutely aware of the worn-out thread on her own uniform. This wasn't envy. It was a profound and constant sense of dislocation, of living a life parallel to the one she was meant for. She was a curator of other people's comfort, a silent witness to their joys and excesses, while her own life felt like a series of deferred moments, a promise of a future that seemed to recede with every passing day. The journey home was a descent, a shedding of the false skin of the Obsidian's glamour. The polished gleam of Manhattan gave way to the gritty reality of Queens, the air growing thick with the scent of exhaust and fried food. Her apartment was small, every surface cluttered not with memories, but with the apparatus of illness. An IV stand huddled in a corner like a metal skeleton, and the kitchen table was a battlefield of orange prescription bottles, insurance forms, and letters stamped with red, urgent warnings of overdue payments. The silence here was different from the hotel's. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the unspoken fear that hung in the air like a fine dust, settling on everything she owned, everything she was. This suffocating world had a name, Sophia. Her younger sister, whose laughter once filled these small rooms, now lay frail and pale in the bedroom they shared. Leukemia. The word itself was an intruder, a violent presence that had rewritten their lives, recasting Elena from a sister into a full-time caretaker, nurse, and sole provider. Elena's life had narrowed to this single, all-consuming purpose: to keep the fragile flame of her sister's life from being extinguished. The love she felt for Sophia was a fierce, primal force, the very core of her being. But it was also an anchor, holding her in place while the currents of her own life rushed past, unseen and unlived, pulling her further and further from the shore of her own dreams. The weight of this unchosen existence was a physical presence, a tightness in her shoulders, and a permanent ache behind her eyes. She was the pillar holding up her family's crumbling world, expected to be strong, resilient, and unwavering. No one asked how she felt. They only looked to her for solutions she didn't have. In the quiet moments of the night, when Sophia's shallow breathing was the only sound, Elena would stare at her own reflection in the dark window. She saw a 22-year-old woman with the soul of a weary elder, a girl whose innocence had been methodically stripped away not by a lover's touch, but by the cold, clinical hands of fate. And in that reflection, a terrifying, desperate thought began to take root, a whisper that told her that pillars, no matter how strong, can eventually break. Her mother, Maria, was a woman sculpted by hardship. Her love for Elena a complex and brittle thing intertwined with the sharp edges of fear and expectation. When Elena returned from the hotel, Maria's gaze would sweep over her, a silent inventory checking for signs of fatigue that could compromise her work, or worse, any hint of a life lived for herself. Their conversations were clipped, functional, revolving around grocery lists and Sophia's medication schedule, but beneath the mundane words lay a heavy, unspoken covenant. Elena was the family's designated martyr, the strong one, and Maria's anxious love was the hammer that continually tested the strength of that pillar. Every sigh from her mother, every worried glance at the mail, was another stone added to the weight on Elena's shoulders, a silent reminder that her life was not her own to navigate, but a vessel to carry her family to safety. The evenings were dedicated to the sacred, painful ritual of caring for Sophia. In the small bedroom they shared, the air thick with the antiseptic smell of rubbing alcohol, Elena would gently bathe her sister's frail body, her touch a language of love that required no words. She would read aloud from worn paperbacks, her voice a low, steady murmur meant to be a shield against the pain and fear that lived in Sophia's eyes. This intimacy was the only true warmth in Elena's life, a profound connection that both fueled her and drained her. The room was their sanctuary, but with every passing day, its walls felt more like the boundaries of a prison cell. The love was pure and absolute, but the act of loving was a slow, methodical erasure of herself, a sacrifice she made willingly, breath by painful breath. The physical proof of their desperation lived in a shoebox on the kitchen table. It was a mountain of paper, hospital invoices, letters from the insurance company with circled phrases like "not covered" and "policy limit reached," and increasingly aggressive notices from collection agencies. Elena would sit under the flickering fluorescent light, tracing the impossible numbers with her finger. The formal, impersonal language of the letters felt like a personal judgment, each one a testament to her failure. The debt was more than a financial burden. It was a moral weight, a constant, humming anxiety that settled deep in her bones. It was the monster that lurked in the quiet of the night, whispering that her love and her labor would never be enough to save the one person she couldn't bear to lose. The neighborhood itself was a character in her story, a tight-knit community in Queens that watched her with a mixture of pity and reverence. The old woman at the bodega who always gave her a sad smile, the neighbors who would speak of her in hushed, admiring tones as, "that good girl, Elena." Their collective gaze was another form of pressure, cementing her into the role of the self-sacrificing saint. She was a local legend of filial piety, an identity she had never asked for but was forced to uphold. To deviate from this path, to show a crack in her stoic facade or admit to a single selfish desire, would be to disappoint them all. It would be a betrayal not just of her family but of the very story the community had written for her, trapping her in a narrative of virtuous suffering. Her isolation was nearly absolute, a chasm separating her from the world of people her own age. Occasionally, a text message would light up her phone, an old high school friend inviting her for a drink, a cousin asking about a party. Her refusals were always polite, vaguely citing work or her sister's health, excuses that were both true and a shield for a more profound truth. She no longer knew how to exist in that world. Late at night, she would scroll through social media feeds, a silent ghost observing lives filled with casual laughter, clumsy dates, and spontaneous road trips. Each photo was a small, sharp sting, a reminder of the youth that was being siphoned away from her, drop by drop, leaving her a hollowed-out version of the woman she might have been. The unspoken expectation of marriage was a constant, low-level hum in the background of her life, a pressure her mother applied with clumsy subtlety. Maria would talk about Carlos, the son of a family friend, who had a steady job with the city and, quote, sensible hands. He was presented not as a romantic prospect, but as a strategic alliance, a practical solution to their financial woes. A good husband could help, Maria would say, her eyes avoiding Elena's. The suggestion made Elena's stomach clench. It felt like a proposition to sell a different part of herself, to trade her body and her future for a life of loveless security. It was another cage being constructed around her, gilded with the promise of stability, but built with the bars of obligation, another life chosen for her. This pressure was deeply rooted in the soil of their family's tradition. As the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything for a foothold in a new country, Elena was expected to embody the old-world values of duty and familial honor. A woman's worth was measured by her selflessness, her purity, and her unwavering loyalty to her blood. These were not rules that were ever spoken aloud, but they were woven into the fabric of their existence, present in every cautionary tale her mother told, in every disapproving glance from an elder relative. Elena felt the immense weight of generations of women who had placed the needs of their family before their own heart, and she was suffocating under the expectation to do the same without question or complaint. Her own dreams were a luxury, a foreign currency in their economy of survival. A visit to the hospital offered a moment of treacherous, fragile hope. Dr. Evans, a man with kind eyes and a weary voice, spoke of a new experimental treatment. He used cautious clinical terms like positive preliminary results and potential for remission. But for a few breathless moments, the words hung in the sterile air like a prayer being answered. Sophia's eyes, usually clouded with pain, held a flicker of light. But then came the crushing blow. The doctor slid a brochure across the desk, and Elena's gaze fell on the cost. The number was obscene, a figure so far beyond their reality it seemed like a misprint. The hope that had bloomed in her chest withered instantly, replaced by a cold, sickening despair. The cure existed, but it was locked away in a world they couldn't afford to enter. The walk home from the hospital was a descent into a new level of desperation. The brief, cruel glimmer of hope made her reality feel darker and more inescapable than ever before. The vibrant, indifferent energy of the city streets felt like an insult. The laughter of strangers, a mockery of her silent anguish. She did the math over and over in her head, a frantic, useless calculation. Her wages from the hotel, the meager tips, the few dollars her mother earned from mending clothes. It was a pittance against the mountain of debt they already faced. She was standing before an unscalable wall, and every conventional path, working more hours, seeking charity, praying for a miracle, had crumbled into dust at her feet. There was no way out. The feeling of being trapped was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical certainty. Later that night, in the profound silence of their shared room, Elena watched the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Sophia's chest. The city lights cast long shadows on the wall, and in the dim reflection of the window, she saw her own face. The exhaustion was there, etched into the lines around her eyes, but a new expression was emerging from beneath it, a chilling, unfamiliar resolve. Her mind drifted from the cramped apartment to the cavernous, silent penthouse at the Obsidian. She thought of the man who lived there, a ghost surrounded by a fortune so vast it was meaningless. An idea, monstrous and terrifying, began to uncoil in the darkest corner of her mind. It was not born of desire, but of a cold, stark calculus. The thought itself felt like a transgression, a betrayal of the good, pure girl everyone believed her to be. But it was also the only key she could see to a lock she had to open. The penthouse suite of Julian Croft was less a home and more a museum of a life meticulously curated to keep emotion at a distance. Lena had cleaned it every day for 6 months, yet she knew nothing of the man who lived there beyond the evidence of his rigid self-control. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets, no chaotic piles of books or magazines. Everything was slate gray, polished chrome, and black leather, arranged with a geometric precision that felt both impressive and profoundly lonely. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan, a glittering, vibrant world that the suite seemed designed to observe but never touch. Cleaning this space was like tending to a beautiful, sterile tomb, and Elena often wondered about the ghost who haunted its perfect, silent halls. The staff at the Obsidian spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones, calling him the Ghost. He was Julian Croft, the enigmatic CEO of Croft Innovations, a man who had built a technology empire from nothing and now lived sealed away from the world he dominated. They said he never entertained guests, that his meals were delivered on a silent cart left outside his door, and that he communicated with his own staff primarily through terse, impersonal emails. Elena pieced together an image of a man who had intentionally severed his ties to humanity, preferring the predictable logic of algorithms to the messy, unreliable chaos of human connection. The coldness of his suite was not a matter of interior design. It was a manifesto, a declaration of emotional exile she found both terrifying and strangely pitiable. One afternoon, while dusting a minimalist bookshelf that held only financial journals and technical manuals, her cloth snagged on the sharp corner of a silver picture frame. It was turned face down. A flicker of forbidden curiosity made her fingers tremble as she hesitated, her duty warring with a sudden, intense need to understand. She resisted the urge to look, but the gesture itself was a revelation. It was the only object in the entire penthouse that was out of place, a single, deliberate disruption in a universe of perfect order. It spoke of a memory so painful it had to be physically blinded, a wound hidden in plain sight. It was the first clue she had ever found of the man behind the myth, a hint of a past so devastating it had compelled him to build a fortress of glass and steel around his heart. Her routine was inviolable. She was to be out of the penthouse by 5 p.m. long before he returned. But a spilled bottle of red wine on a white rug, the only evidence of carelessness she had ever witnessed, had delayed her. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, she was on her hands and knees, meticulously blotting the stain, her world reduced to the scent of cleaning solution and the soft fibers of the expensive carpet. The silence of the suite was absolute, a soundproof bubble high above the city's roar. She was so focused on her task, on erasing the single blemish of chaos, that she didn't hear the whisper-quiet slide of the private elevator door opening directly into the living area. His presence was not announced by a sound, but by a sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. The air grew colder, heavier. Elena froze, her hand hovering over the damp spot on the rug. Slowly, she lifted her head. He stood by the window, a tall, severe silhouette against the dying light. Julian Croft. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his shoulders broad, his posture rigid. He wasn't looking at the city, but at her. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, even from across the vast room, were piercing, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a man who missed nothing and felt nothing, and she felt pinned by their intensity, a specimen under a microscope. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched, thick with a tension that made her skin prickle. She should have apologized, gathered her things, and fled, but his gaze held her captive. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was exactly as she had imagined, a low, controlled baritone that seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. "You missed a spot," he said, his words clipped and precise. He didn't gesture toward the rug. His gaze flickered to a tiny, almost invisible smudge of dust on the chrome leg of the coffee table a few feet away from her. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a demonstration of his unnerving powers of observation. It was a reminder that she was an employee and he was her employer, a chasm between them as wide as the city below. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She forced herself to meet his eyes directly for the first time. They were a startlingly pale gray, like a winter sky, and in their depths she saw not just coldness, but a profound, aching weariness. It was a look she recognized, a mirror of the exhaustion that lived deep in her own bones. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just finishing up," she managed to whisper, her voice thin and unfamiliar. He continued to watch her, his head tilted slightly, a flicker of something analytical in his expression. It felt as if he were running a diagnostic, processing her presence as an unexpected variable in his carefully controlled equation, and she felt a desperate urge to be anything but a problem for this man. He took a step closer, and she instinctively flinched, pulling back on her heels. The movement was small, but he noticed it. His expression didn't change, but she sensed a subtle shift in the energy between them. He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to people recoiling from him in fear, but perhaps he was accustomed to a different kind of fear, the deference of subordinates, the anxiety of competitors. Her reaction was something else, raw, instinctual, personal. For the first time, she felt a strange, terrifying sense of power. In her unfeigned fear, she had shown him something real, something that couldn't be bought or negotiated. She was not a part of his sterile, predictable world, and her very presence was a disruption he hadn't anticipated. His gaze dropped from her face to her hands, raw and red from harsh cleaning chemicals and the endless washing required for Sophia's care. They were the hands of a worker, a stark contrast to the manicured perfection of everything else in his life. He looked at them for a long, silent moment. It felt more intimate than if he had touched her. He was seeing the truth of her life in the cracked skin and broken nails. When he finally looked back at her face, the analytical coldness in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity or sympathy. It was a flicker of intense, unsettling curiosity. "Go," he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "You're done for the day." Elena scrambled to her feet, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and a strange, exhilarating fear. She gathered her cleaning cart, her movements clumsy, her mind reeling. She didn't dare look at him again as she pushed the cart toward the service exit, but she could feel his eyes on her back the entire time, a tangible pressure that followed her out of the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, she leaned against the cool wall of the corridor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had irrevocably altered her reality. Julian Croft was no longer a ghost. He was a man. And in his cold, weary eyes, she had seen not the solution to her problem, but the terrifying, magnetic face of her own desperation. The days that followed their encounter were steeped in a new, suffocating tension. The penthouse was no longer a neutral space of labor. It was his territory, every surface now charged with the memory of his presence. Elena found herself cleaning with a heightened, almost painful awareness. She would polish the surface of his vast obsidian desk, imagining his hands resting there, and her own breath would catch in her throat. She felt his gaze, even when he wasn't there, a phantom pressure on the back of her neck. The silence was different now, too. It was no longer empty. It was expectant, as if the entire suite were holding its breath, waiting for him to return, and for the next scene in their unnerving, unspoken play to begin. She was an actress who hadn't been given a script, moving through a set that felt increasingly real and dangerous. She began to see him in the small details he left behind, clues to the man who lived behind the impenetrable facade. A single empty whiskey glass left by the window overlooking the city. A book of Stoic philosophy left open on a leather armchair, its spine barely cracked. These were not signs of carelessness. They were too deliberate, too placed. It felt like a test, a silent communication she couldn't decipher. He was revealing microscopic parts of himself, and she wasn't sure if it was intentional, or if she was simply projecting her own desperate need for connection onto these inanimate objects. This ghost was slowly acquiring a form, a substance, and the more human he became, the more monstrous her own cold, calculated plan felt to her, a violation not just of her body, but of a nascent, fragile understanding. Her work became a form of archaeology, digging for a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to find. She would arrange the financial journals on his nightstand, and her fingers would linger on the cold paper, wondering what thoughts occupied his mind in the lonely hours before dawn. Did he dream? Did he ever feel the same crushing weight of existence that settled on her own shoulders each night? The questions were dangerous. A breach of the sterile professional distance she desperately needed to maintain. She was there to clean his home, and, eventually, to sell a piece of herself for a price. She was not supposed to wonder about the contents of his soul, but with every polished surface and folded sheet, she felt herself being drawn deeper into his orbit, the gravitational pull of his solitude proving unexpectedly powerful. A week later he was there. She opened the service door to the penthouse, and the scent of fresh coffee, dark and bitter, hit her first. He was standing by the window, wearing a simple gray t-shirt and dark trousers, a stark departure from his severe suit. He held a ceramic mug in his hands, and for a moment he looked almost ordinary. He turned his head as she entered, and his pale gray eyes met hers. There was no surprise in them, only a quiet, unnerving watchfulness. "Good morning, Elena," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the polished floor beneath her feet. The use of her name, a word he had never spoken before, felt both like a courtesy and a claim, a simple acknowledgement that stripped away her professional invisibility and made her feel utterly, terrifyingly seen. She murmured a reply, her voice barely a whisper, and began her work, her movements stiff and self-conscious. She could feel him watching her every move. When she dusted the bookshelf, she was acutely aware of the way his gaze followed the sweep of her cloth. When she straightened the cushions on the sofa, she felt as if his eyes were tracing the lines of her body through the cheap fabric of her uniform. It was not a lecherous gaze. It was something far more unsettling. It was analytical, curious, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. She was no longer just the chambermaid. She was the girl who had stood before him, shaking and desperate, and offered him her innocence. That knowledge hung in the air between them, a thick, unbreachable wall of tension. He didn't speak again for nearly an hour. The only sounds were the soft swish of her cleaning cloth and the quiet click of his mug being set down on a coaster. The silence was a conversation in itself, filled with everything they couldn't say. She was there to earn money to save her sister. He was the man who had agreed to a cold commercial transaction. Yet in this shared silence, something else was taking root. She found herself noticing the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he rubbed the back of his neck as he stared out at the city. She saw not a powerful CEO, but a man encased in a fortress of his own making. The empathy she felt was a betrayal of her purpose, a dangerous crack in her own carefully constructed armor. The next day, a small, profound change had occurred in the penthouse. On a stark, empty side table where nothing had ever been placed, there was now a single, delicate white orchid in a simple glass vase. It was the only living thing in the entire suite, besides him. Its presence was a shock, a splash of organic, fragile beauty in a world of chrome and leather. Elena stopped in her tracks, staring at it. It felt like a message, a symbol she was meant to understand. Orchids were notoriously difficult to care for. They required patience, specific conditions, a gentle hand. It seemed so out of place, so contrary to his nature, yet it also felt like a confession, a silent admission of a desire for something real and alive in his sterile existence. She approached the flower cautiously, her fingers hovering over a velvety petal. The urge to touch it, to confirm its reality, was overwhelming. She saw her own reflection in the polished table beneath it, a tired girl in a drab uniform, standing before a symbol of impossible grace. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the flower was for her. Not a gift, but a statement. It was a reminder of the fragility and beauty of the thing she was offering to sell, and she couldn't decide if it was a gesture of cruelty or a plea for her to reconsider. Either way, it complicated everything, weaving a thread of strange, poignant beauty into the ugly fabric of their arrangement and making her task feel infinitely more difficult. This growing intimacy at work made her return home each evening a jarring, painful transition. The sterile beauty of Julian's world, now punctuated by that single orchid, stood in stark contrast to the cluttered, desperate reality of her apartment. The scent of antiseptic that clung to everything, the sight of Sophia's pale face against the pillow, the ever-present stack of medical bills. It all felt harsher, more brutal than before. She would look at her sister's frail form, and the justification for her pact with Julian would surge through her, fierce and protective. This was for Sophia. But then, the memory of his quiet gaze or the image of the solitary orchid would surface, and a wave of profound, sickening guilt would wash over her. She was saving one life by potentially destroying her own soul. Her internal world became a battlefield. One part of her, the pragmatic survivor, clung to the clinical nature of the deal. It was a means to an end, a transaction of the flesh to save her family. This part of her needed Julian to remain a monster, a cold, unfeeling billionaire who was simply buying a product. But another part of her, a part she had long suppressed, was stirring. It was the part that recognized the loneliness in his eyes, that felt a strange flutter in her chest when he said her name, that was captivated by the mystery of the orchid. This part of her was terrified not of the physical act itself, but of the possibility of feeling something for the man who was paying for it. That would be the true transgression. She began to experience a desire so foreign and frightening it felt like a sickness. It wasn't just a physical craving, but a yearning for the very thing their contract was meant to bypass: intimacy. She found herself wanting to know what made him laugh, what memories were hidden behind the picture frame he kept face down, what his touch would feel like if it were offered with tenderness instead of purchased with cold, hard cash. This desire was a betrayal of Sophia, of her mother, of the good, self-sacrificing girl everyone believed her to be. It was a selfish, dangerous seed taking root in the barren soil of her life, and she feared that if it were allowed to grow, it would consume what little was left of her. The moral calculus of her decision became impossibly complex. She had approached him with a clear, desperate objective: to trade her body for her sister's life. It was a noble sacrifice, a martyr's choice. But now, with the slow intrusion of genuine confusing emotion, the lines had blurred. If she went through with it now, knowing there was a flicker of connection, a hint of a man she could potentially care for, what would that make her? Would it still be a sacrifice? Or would it be a selfish act of curiosity and nascent desire, disguised as heroism? The thought horrified her. She was losing control not only of the situation, a situation she had initiated, but of the one thing she had always believed was inviolable: her own heart. He was there again the following day, this time not by the window but sitting in the large leather armchair, the book of philosophy in his lap. He looked up as she entered, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing. "The orchid," he said, his voice quiet. "It needs water." It wasn't an order, but an invitation. He was asking her to participate in the care of the only living thing in his home. He was drawing her in, making her an accomplice in nurturing this fragile symbol that had come to represent the unspoken thing growing between them. Elena's heart hammered in her chest as she picked up the small watering can she used for the hotel's lobby plants, her hand trembling slightly. As she carefully watered the flower, she could feel him watching her. She focused on the dark soil, the delicate roots visible through the glass. Anything to avoid meeting his gaze. "Why did you buy it?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. The silence stretched, and she was sure he wouldn't answer. She had overstepped, broken the unspoken rules of their arrangement. "Because," he finally said, his voice low and raspy, "even rooms like this need to be reminded that some things can still grow." The admission was so raw, so vulnerable. It struck her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't talking about the flower. He was talking about himself. He was talking about them. She finished watering the plant and turned to face him. He was no longer looking at her, but staring down at the book in his lap, his knuckles white as he gripped the cover. She saw in that moment a man fighting a war with himself, a man terrified of the very hope he had just articulated. Her own conflict mirrored his, a dizzying reflection of fear and longing. The powerful, cold billionaire was gone, replaced by someone as lost and wounded as she was. The chasm between them, once defined by wealth and power, was now filled with a shared, terrifying vulnerability. The urge to cross that space, to reach out and touch his hand, was so powerful it made her dizzy. It was a desire to comfort, to connect, to heal. She took a half-step toward him, her hands slightly outstretched, before catching herself. The movement, however small, broke the spell. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked at her outstretched hand as if it were a weapon. He had let his guard down for a fraction of a second, and her instinctive response had shown him how dangerous that was. He stood up abruptly, the book falling to the floor with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "You should go," he said, his voice once again clipped and cold, the mask of the ruthless CEO snapping back into place. "Your shift is over." The warmth of a moment before was gone, replaced by an icy wall of defense. Elena fled, her heart pounding with a chaotic mix of disappointment, fear, and a strange, aching thrill. The encounter had changed everything. The transaction was no longer a simple, ugly necessity. It had become entangled with the far more dangerous currencies of hope and emotion. As she rode the elevator down, the sterile, mirrored walls reflected a woman she no longer recognized. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with unshed tears and a terrifying, vibrant life. She had come to this man to save her sister, but she was beginning to fear that, in the process, she was walking into a gilded cage of her own, one where the price of a touch was no longer a simple figure on a check, but the potential wreckage of her entire soul. The date loomed on the calendar, a silent, black-inked executioner marking the final day before their contract was to be fulfilled. Each morning, Elena entered the penthouse with a leaden weight in her stomach, the sterile air feeling less like a workplace and more like a gilded cage where she was both prisoner and bait. The unspoken agreement hung between them, a thick, suffocating fog that made every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands as she cleaned around him, feel like a dangerous spark. She found herself cataloging the line of his jaw as he stared at the city, the weary slump of his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. She was supposed to be hardening her heart for the clinical transaction ahead, but instead it was cracking open, leaving her terrifyingly exposed to the man she was meant to use and discard. That afternoon he was there, a statue of controlled tension, staring at the massive television screen that dominated one wall. It was muted, but the images were sharp and clear, a live broadcast from a tech conference. And then, the camera focused on a woman at the podium, her smile bright and predatory. Elena recognized her from the tabloids. Julian's ex-fiancée, the architect of his public betrayal. A caption appeared beneath her name, crediting her as the CEO of a rival company built on technology he had pioneered. Elena saw it before she truly understood it. A flicker in his composure, a tightening around his eyes so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone else. But she had been studying him for weeks, and she saw the precise moment the ghost of his past rose up to haunt him in high definition. His control, usually so absolute, began to visibly fracture. His breathing grew shallow, a quiet, ragged sound in the immense silence of the room. He turned away from the screen, his movements stiff, robotic, as if his own body were a foreign entity he could no longer command. His hand, resting on the back of a leather chair, began to tremble. Elena froze, her cleaning cloth clutched in her fist, a helpless witness to his unraveling. This was not the cold, powerful billionaire. This was a man being pulled under by a current of invisible pain, drowning in the pristine air of his own empty fortress. The sight of his raw, unguarded suffering was a spear to her heart, obliterating the last vestiges of the transactional distance she had tried so desperately to maintain between them. He took a stumbling step toward the wet bar, perhaps seeking the familiar burn of whiskey to anchor him. His coordination failed him. His unsteady hand knocked against a crystal tumbler, sending it crashing to the polished marble floor. The sound was a gunshot, a violent explosion in the curated silence. Shards of glass skittered across the floor like scattered diamonds. He flinched, trying to steady himself, and his hand came down hard on a sharp, jagged piece. A dark crimson bloomed against his pale skin, the color shockingly vibrant in the monochromatic room. He stared at the blood welling in his palm with a look of detached surprise, as if it belonged to someone else, a final, visceral confirmation that his defenses had been breached from the inside out. In that instant, every calculated thought in Elena's mind evaporated. The contract, the money, the desperate, ugly reason she was there, it all turned to dust. All she saw was him. A man, bleeding and broken, lost in a private hell she couldn't comprehend, but whose pain was as real and tangible as the glass on the floor. Her body moved before her mind could object, a pure, unpremeditated act of instinct. It was the ultimate transgression, a complete violation of the unspoken rules of their arrangement. She was not supposed to care. She was not supposed to touch him unless she was paid. But as she rushed across the vast room, she knew she was crossing a line from which there could be no return, abandoning her role as a seller to answer a more fundamental human call. She reached him and knelt on the cold marble, the shards of glass crunching softly beneath her knees. She didn't speak. Words were useless, clumsy things in the face of such raw agony. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his injured hand in hers. The touch was electric, a universe of sensation in a single point of contact. His skin was cold, clammy with shock, yet a tremor of life pulsed beneath the surface. The blood was warm and slick against her own calloused fingers. It was a gesture of profound, uncalculated intimacy. A simple act of care that was more honest and more revealing than the physical union they had contracted for. In that touch, She was no longer the chambermaid, and he was no longer the billionaire. They were just two people, bound by a wound. Julian's head snapped up, his pale gray eyes wide with a stunning, profound shock. He stared at her, then down at their joined hands, as if he were seeing a miracle or a hallucination. He, a man who believed every human interaction was a transaction, who had built an empire on the certainty that kindness was merely a prelude to betrayal, was now being offered comfort with no strings attached. She could see the war in his eyes, the ingrained suspicion battling against a desperate, starved need for a gentle touch. His entire worldview, the cynical armor he had worn for years, was fracturing under the simple, unassuming pressure of her hand. For the first time, she saw past the ghost, past the CEO, and looked directly into the eyes of the wounded man he had tried so hard to bury. The power dynamic between them inverted completely. With a gentleness that surprised even herself, she guided him away from the broken glass and sat him down in the large leather armchair. She was no longer the frightened girl who had trembled before him. She was the calm center of his storm. She retrieved the first aid kit from a bathroom, her movements efficient and sure, a muscle memory from years of tending to Sophia. Kneeling before him again, she carefully cleaned the wound, her touch practical and steady, her focus absolute. Each dab of antiseptic, each careful application of a bandage, was an act of devotion, a silent vow that she saw his pain, that he was not alone in this sterile, silent room. He watched her every move, his expression one of dazed, vulnerable wonder. When she finished, she didn't immediately let go. Her hand lingered over his, her thumb gently stroking the back of his knuckles. The broken glass remained on the floor, a glittering testament to the chaos that had just torn through their carefully constructed reality. The silence that fell was different from before. It was not the heavy, tense silence of expectation, but a fragile, sacred quiet, filled with the immensity of what had just passed between them. He made no move to pull his hand away. Instead, his fingers curled slightly, a weak but definite response, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, her care. It was a surrender, a quiet admission that he was tired of fighting, tired of being alone in his pain. He finally broke the silence, his voice a raw, broken whisper she barely recognized. "Elena," he said. It wasn't a statement or a command. It was a question, an utterance of disbelief, the sound of a man speaking a foreign language for the first time. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw the ruins of his fortress in his eyes. The contract lay in ashes between them, an obscene and meaningless document in the face of this raw, terrifying and beautiful human connection. The transaction she had come here for was now impossible. Her simple, instinctive touch had not been for sale, and they both knew, with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that it had just cost them everything. The elevator descended in a silence, more profound than any she had ever experienced in his suite. Elena stared at her own reflection in the polished steel doors, a ghost of a girl with wild eyes and a smudge of his dried blood near her cuff. The numbers on the display ticked down, each one a step further away from the man she had just left bleeding in his fortress of glass. His final words, "Your shift is over," echoed in her mind not as a dismissal from a job, but as an exile from a fragile, nascent world they had accidentally created. The transaction was complete, but not the one she had proposed. He had paid her, not for her body, but for the terrifying intimacy of her touch, and in doing so, had banished her from his life forever. The cold, clinical nature of the exchange was what she had wanted, but the reality of it felt like a brutal amputation. Her journey home was a blur of motion and light, the familiar rumble of the subway a distant, meaningless noise. She clutched the strap of her bag, her knuckles white, her mind replaying the moment she had taken his hand. It was an act of pure instinct, a reflex born from years of caring for Sophia, yet it had irrevocably shattered the cold artifice of their agreement. A notification vibrated in her pocket, a sterile, impersonal text message from her bank. She didn't need to look, she knew what it was. It was the price, the obscene number that would save her sister's life. It felt less like a salvation and more like a brand, a permanent mark on her soul that testified to the moment she had seen a man's broken heart and been paid to walk away from it, leaving him to piece it back together alone. The moment she stepped into her apartment, the heavy air, thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol and her mother's weary cooking, felt like a physical blow. The cluttered reality of their lives, the mountain of medical supplies, the worn-out furniture, it all seemed to mock the impossible wealth that now sat in her bank account. Sophia was asleep in their shared room, her breathing a shallow, fragile rhythm in the quiet. Elena stood in the doorway, watching her sister, the reason for this entire monstrous bargain. A wave of love, so fierce it was painful, washed over her, followed immediately by a tide of sickening guilt. She had secured Sophia's future, but she had done it by walking away from a man in his moment of greatest vulnerability, making her feel like the most profound kind of coward. Later, under the flickering kitchen light, she showed the banking app to her mother. The number on the screen glowed with an alien luminescence. Maria stared at it, her eyes widening in disbelief before filling with tears. She clutched Elena's hands, her sobs a mixture of relief and bewildered joy, thanking God, the saints, and the mysterious benefactor Elena had vaguely alluded to. Her mother's unquestioning gratitude was a knife in Elena's heart. There was no way to explain the true cost, no way to articulate that the money was not a gift but a severance, a payment to ensure her silence and her absence. In her family's moment of triumph, Elena felt more isolated than ever, a stranger in her own home, guarding a secret that felt as heavy as a tombstone. In the days that followed, Elena moved through a fog of unreality, a ghost in her own life. She made the calls, scheduled the appointments, and signed the papers that would admit Sophia into the experimental treatment program. Each logistical step forward felt like a personal step backward into a deeper void. She imagined Julian in his penthouse, the shards of glass long swept away, the floor polished to an unforgiving sheen, erasing all evidence of his moment of weakness. She pictured him standing by the window, his hand bandaged, his expression once again an impenetrable mask of cold control. Had he thrown out the orchid? The thought came unbidden, a sharp, specific pang of loss. He had pushed her away to protect himself, to rebuild the walls she had so effortlessly breached with a single, gentle touch. The separation was absolute. There was no formal notice from the hotel, no final paycheck, just a profound and unbroken silence. She had been erased from the obsidian as cleanly as she had once erased the fingerprints of its wealthy guests. At night, when the apartment was still and Sophia's breathing was the only sound, the silence from him became a roar in her ears. She would lie awake, feeling the phantom pressure of his hand in hers. The memory of his raw, unguarded eyes burned into her mind. She had gone to him, seeking a simple, ugly transaction, and had stumbled into the far more complex and dangerous territory of the human heart. The money in her account was a constant, mocking reminder of what she had won for her sister, and what she had consequently lost for herself. A strange and unfamiliar anger began to smolder beneath her guilt. It was a quiet, slow-burning rage, directed not at Julian, but at the world that had forced her into such an impossible choice. She had been conditioned to be the good girl, the silent martyr, the one who sacrificed everything for her family without complaint. She had played the part perfectly, even offering up the last untouched piece of herself. But the encounter with Julian had awakened something dormant within her. That moment of instinct, of reaching for him not as a means to an end, but as a simple act of human compassion, had not been a sign of weakness. It had been an act of profound, uncalculated power, a force that had shattered the defenses of a man who believed himself to be invincible. This realization was a quiet, seismic shift in her soul. She was not just a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a game played by forces larger than herself. In that single, transgressive moment, she had been an agent of chaos, of empathy, of a truth that money could not buy, and contracts could not contain. She had held a powerful man's pain in her hands and had not flinched. The knowledge was terrifying, but it was also liberating. It was the first time in her life she had acted not out of duty or desperation, but from a core of authentic feeling. She had lost the possibility of a future with him, but in its place, she was beginning to find the faint, unfamiliar outline of herself, a woman she had never been allowed to be. The guilt remained a constant, aching companion, but it was now intertwined with a nascent sense of self-worth. She would look at her hands, the hands that had cleaned toilets and scrubbed floors, and see them differently. They were not just the tools of a servant, they were the instruments that had offered a moment of grace to a man drowning in his own solitude. She had paid a terrible price for her sister's life, but the cost had been emotional, not physical. She had been forced to confront the depths of her own capacity for compassion, and then to live with the silence that followed. She was a survivor, not just of poverty and familial duty, but of a profound and heartbreaking emotional collision. One evening, as she sat by Sophia's bedside, watching the gentle rise and fall of her sister's chest, a fragile peace settled over her. The path ahead for Sophia was long and uncertain, but now it was a path that existed. Hope, real and tangible, had been purchased. Elena reached out and gently brushed a stray hair from her sister's forehead. Her touch was steady, sure. She had walked through fire and had come out the other side, scorched and changed, but not destroyed. She had been dismissed, cast out by the man whose life she had irrevocably altered, but she knew with a chilling certainty that, just as he now haunted her waking thoughts, the memory of her touch, freely given and fiercely compassionate, would be the ghost that would haunt him in his silent, gilded cage. 6 months passed, each one a brushstroke painting a new, tentative reality over the canvas of Elena's life. The sterile, metallic scent of the hospital was slowly being replaced by the smell of autumn leaves and brewing tea in their small queen's apartment. Sophia, though still fragile, was responding to the treatment. The color was returning to her cheeks, a quiet miracle that Elena witnessed with a heart that was both overflowing with gratitude and hollowed by a persistent, aching void. She had won the war for her sister's life, but the peace felt incomplete, haunted by the ghost of a man in a glass tower. She had bought her family's future with a silence that cost her a piece of her own, a piece she wasn't sure she could ever reclaim. She had saved Sophia, but she had left Julian bleeding, and the memory of his raw vulnerability was a debt that no amount of money could ever truly repay. His presence was a phantom limb, an ache where something had been brutally severed. She would see a man in a perfectly tailored suit on the street, and her breath would catch, her heart performing a painful, hopeful leap before the stranger's face would come into focus, a disappointment so sharp it felt like a fresh wound. She found herself staring up at the Manhattan skyline from her apartment window, her eyes invariably drawn to the jagged peak of the Obsidian, wondering if he was up there, watching the city as she was, two lonely souls separated by a chasm of wealth, fear, and a single, unforgettable touch. She had been erased from his world, yet he had become an indelible part of hers, a silent, constant question mark that hung over every moment of her newfound fragile peace, a reminder that some transactions leave both parties irrevocably in debt to one another. Then, one crisp November afternoon, it arrived, a simple, elegant black box delivered by a courier who looked profoundly out of place on her worn-out doorstep. There was no return address, but her hands trembled as she accepted it, a deep, instinctual knowledge resonating in her bones. She placed it on the small kitchen table, the same table that had once been buried under a mountain of medical debt. For a long moment she just stared at it, a perfect, dark monolith in the humble landscape of her life. With a breath that felt like she was drawing it from the bottom of her soul, she lifted the lid. Nestled in a cloud of white tissue paper was a simple glass vase, and in it, vibrant, alive, and impossibly beautiful, was a single white orchid, its petals unblemished, its roots strong and healthy. It was not a new flower. It was Lime Blue Blythe, the one from the penthouse, the one he had bought, to remind himself that some things could still grow. The fact that he had kept it, nurtured it, and now sent it to her was a message more eloquent than any letter he could have written. It was a confession, an apology, and a plea, all contained within the silent living beauty of its form. He was telling her that he hadn't let it die. He was telling her that the hope it represented, the fragile connection that had sparked between them in his sterile, lonely world, had not withered in her absence. She gently touched a velvety petal, the sensation a ghostly echo of the moment she had taken his hand, and a single, cleansing tear traced a path down her cheek. The orchid wasn't a memory of what was lost. It was proof of what had survived. A new resolve, clean and sharp, crystallized within her. The fear and guilt that had been her constant companions for months finally receded, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. She had been the one to run to him in his moment of crisis, and he had been the one to push her away. Now he was reaching back. not with the power of his wealth, but with the vulnerability of a shared memory. She would not let his fear, or her own, be the final word in their story. She took a simple piece of stationery, her hand perfectly steady, and wrote not a letter, but a simple, clear invitation. She wrote her address. Just that. She sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to Julian Croft at the Obsidian, and walked to the corner mailbox, her steps light and sure. The power dynamic had shifted one last time. She was no longer coming to his world, she was inviting him into hers. She placed the orchid on the windowsill in her bedroom, its white petals a beacon of impossible grace against the gritty backdrop of the Queen's cityscape. It was a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of a connection that defied logic and circumstance. That evening, as the city lights began to glitter to life, a sound, foreign and out of place, cut through the familiar hum of the neighborhood, the low, purring rumble of a luxury car engine idling on her street. Elena didn't move to the window. She simply stood by the flower, her heart a frantic, joyous bird in her chest, and waited. The past was a landscape of pain and sacrifice, the future an unwritten page, but in this single, suspended moment, there was only the profound, terrifying, and beautiful certainty of his arrival. If you believe a single moment of connection can rewrite a life, and want to continue this journey with us, we invite you to subscribe, to share this story, and to let us know in the comments how it made you feel.